Yes, the political gamble has almost certainly paid off for Japan's Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi. She called a snap election. She is on course to win a landslide victory tonight. The country's first female leader called the vote after less than 4 months in office to try to end the rule of coalition politics, reviving the fortune of the ailing Liberal Democrats, which were besieged with corruption allegations. Personality politics appears to have been front and centre. The continuing rise of Sanae Takaichi. Some of the polls before the elections, perhaps why she triggered the snap election, suggested the figures were something like 70% popularity, with the 18 to 29-year-old category up to 90%. Extraordinary, unprecedented in recent years of Japan's politics. A heavy metal drummer, formerly in a band, fan of Margaret Thatcher. She said she sleeps between 2 to 4 hours a night. Some call her the Iron Maiden, promising a change for the country. Let's bring in Kristi Govella, Associate Professor of Japanese Politics and International Relations at the Nissan Institute of Japanese Studies. Good to speak to you tonight, Kristi. First of all, your take on how she has turned this party around.
Well, it's really been a striking change. If we look at the last year, the Liberal Democratic Party has really been struggling. They lost their majority in both houses in the last two elections. They've been suffering low approval ratings in the 20 and 30% range. And then enter Sanae Takaichi, who becomes the first female prime minister of Japan in October and really has taken the country by storm. I think a lot of people in Japan look at her and they hope that she's a new kind of leader for the LDP. She seems to be something of a maverick. She has a vision. As you said in the intro, she's quite popular with young people. And the hope is that she's going to be able to do something to turn around the domestic economic challenges that Japan is facing with high inflation, the weak yen, high prices for commodities like rice, and also be able to set the country on a positive long-term trajectory on issues like security and foreign policy. So she has a pretty tall order ahead of her, but it's really striking the energy that she's brought to the Liberal Democratic Party over the past few months.
What is it about her personality? I mean, I see Japanese press calling her distinctive and really appealing with young people. What is it?
Yes, well, she has a very unique upbringing for a politician in the sense that she comes from a working class family. Her mother was a policewoman. Her father worked for a subsidiary of Toyota as an office worker. She was a heavy metal drummer. She's an avid motorcyclist. And she just is not in the mold of the typical LDP politician that many voters have come to become quite tired of actually in recent years. So she has come onto the scene despite, possible doubts about her ability to lead just because she hasn't been a huge figure on the national scene. And, she's really made a splash. She had a successful summit with President Trump in October. She had a visit with South Korean President Lee that went viral as they played drums together to K-pop songs. And so if you look at her ability to communicate with the population on social media, to connect with young voters, and to present energy toward the future, this is really something that has been lacking in recent years.
What do you make of the Margaret Thatcher comparisons? I've spoken to a number of politicians in the past couple of weeks talking about how she has this ferocious intelligence. She's very, very carefully crafted her image. She used to have pink hair, I think, years ago. Even that haircut is crafted down to a political appeal. I heard a hairdresser be interviewed saying she wanted to show her eyes, to show emotion. So she's very well aware. But Margaret Thatcher was a fiscal hawk, anything but for Sanae Takaichi.
So I think the comparisons to Thatcher are apt in the image of a strong conservative leader that Takaichi wants to portray. I do think she takes inspiration from that. But on the policy level, there are many differences. Takaichi is really facing, a very different situation in the Japan of 2026, where she is under pressure to give short-term relief to Japanese citizens through things like tax cuts on food, support for households. And so this is a situation where, she is widely expected to accelerate government spending. Now, she's trying to balance that image by saying that she can also take a long-term approach, that she has a fiscally responsible approach to spending. And so, I think that the comparison to Thatcher is definitely a compelling one in some ways, but it all comes down to the details, and we have yet to see what she'll really be able to do. But now she has a mandate to do it in the coming months.
And the heavy metal drumming is an interesting aspect that people clearly like as well. She talked about, I think she's given recent interviews, she loves Def Leppard, she loves Black Sabbath, Iron Maiden, hence this nickname, the moniker that comes up, Iron Maiden. But if you look deeper into her life, so she was a mentor of hers, I think I'm right in saying, was Shinzo Abe. And she's from, I think, a working class district of well, one of the original kind of regal cities of Japan as well, in Nara, is that right? Shinzo Abe, unfortunately, but by circumstance, was also killed in that same city as well. Her career path is very interesting. Talk us through basically her rise to fame, because at one stage she became interior minister, and there were some fears about how she was going to clamp down on the media that appeared to be saying anything critical about Shinzo Abe when she was interior minister. Potentially they'd risk being closed down.
She's had a really interesting rise to the prime ministership. As people have noted, she comes from a working class family. She put herself through school. She, actually worked for an American congresswoman for a year and gained experience that way. And so she comes into the Diet in the 1990s, and she has been a protege of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. So she was never a member of Abe's faction, which is important to note. She has, a relatively independent background in that she hasn't been parts of these powerful groups. But she certainly was somebody that Abe put forward, and she has styled herself as very much in his school of foreign policy. She was formerly, for example, economic security minister. She has also served in other key posts. I think the comparison to Abe is really in, again, much like her calling to comparisons of Thatcher and wanting to invoke this idea that she can be a strong conservative leader, that she can put forward her own kind of idea of economics, like Abe's Abenomics, where she can put forward Sanaenomics and bring the country into a more prosperous, future ahead. And so it's been an interesting rise for someone. She really doesn't have that traditional elite policy background, but she's worked her way to the top. She's been able to use very careful judgment and strategic timing along with personality to get herself there. And, she can really see her draw on these experiences as a media personality earlier in her career to be able to charm not only, leaders like President Trump, but also to portray herself quite compellingly on social media to young voters.
And if we look at the kind of profile, you talked about her early days within the party, her kind of journey to now, something else that appears to, going back to the personality, and it really appears to have actually appealed to a lot of people, this unorthodox even relationships. Am I right in saying that she met her husband and she talked about a proposal of marriage before they even had their first date? He was within politics as well. They later divorced. They got back together. He had a stroke and she is now his carer.
Yes, it's true. It's a very interesting relationship that she has with her husband, who is also a politician. She is still caring for him full time, even as being prime minister. She's very proud of that. But it is a very non-traditional relationship. So I think part of the appeal, again, is that Takaichi is not someone who comes from a very traditional idea of what a politician should be or what a wife should be. But in fact, she has been negotiating these relationships somewhat on her own terms within constraints for many years. So even with her relationship with her husband, we see that she is trying to balance these needs. And she's not someone who has been, for traditionally pro-women policies. For example, she's not someone who is in favor of women keeping their own maiden names after marriage. But in other ways, she does exert a very powerful example of how women can, interact in their relationships and with the political system and forge their own kind of leadership. So I think people find these unusual aspects of Takaichi's background to be quite interesting in a country where politicians often seem to be quite similar.
We've talked about her personality. Let's talk about her challenge politically now. I know Japan, one of the big issues, like we see in many countries, the high price of living, the difficulties for going out, getting everyday living goods and food. She was promising some kind of tax cuts. Tell us about the promises she's made and the scale of the challenge she has.
Well, in Japan, it's a very challenging situation right now because they're facing inflation for the first time in about 30 years. So, when citizens look at their lives, they are paying noticeably more for things like rice, for example. Prices are high, their wages are not going up. So there is an idea that the government needs to do something to correct the situation, and this is a big part of why the Liberal Democratic Party was drubbed in the last two elections prior to this one. They were unable to answer these calls to address the economy, and they were also plagued by issues related to money scandals in politics. So Takaichi has to find a way to do something to relieve the pain for voters. And one idea that's been put forward, for example, is cutting the consumption tax on food temporarily for 2 years. There also have been a number of other proposals for household support, cash handouts, etc. But then an interesting part of the public's demands is there does seem to be a significant portion of the Japanese population that is aware that short-term solutions alone will not put their economy back on a good track in the long term. So I think that the people do want to see short-term relief, but they also want to see some kind of long-term plan that will get the Japanese economy back to a place where they can feel that the future is brighter than the present. And that was something that former Prime Minister Abe was able to do with Abenomics. It had these three arrows, and some of them had short-term goals, and others were quite long-term in scope. So we see Prime Minister Takaichi trying to model that same approach in dealing with voters' demands, but also trying to be realistic about the economy.
And she's a social conservative. I'd like to get your take on this because I think, am I right in saying popularity in terms of support for and public sentiment on gay marriage? She kind of runs against the grain on that, and also on the royal family as well, over the kind of view of wanting an emperor over an empress on that debate too.
Yes, so she is socially conservative. She's not someone who is pushing ahead in the way that might be expected on, as I was mentioning, women keeping their own maiden names. She's not in favor of allowing a female emperor, for example. So she tends to have quite socially conservative views. So the interesting thing has been that we haven't heard a lot of emphasis on that social conservatism since she's come to be prime minister. She seems to be trying to weigh the different concerns of voters across issue areas, and she seems to accurately be gauging that what voters really want to see is a response on the economic side more than her pushing forward on any specific social issues. So it's well known that she has conservative views, but she seems to be taking a rather different approach as prime minister, as trying to prioritize these issues in the order in which the nation appears to see them as urgent. And so right now we see her really heavily focusing on the economy and then on foreign policy, for example. Immigration has also rose to the forefront, especially in recent elections. There has been a more prominent role played by populist parties such as Sanseito, which is campaigning on an explicitly Japanese first platform modeled after President Trump's approach. So I think the place where we see the social conservatism most is in this idea that there needs to be some tightening of controls on immigration, also more supervision of tourists who have been causing issues in Japan lately, partially due to the fact that there are so many of them due to the weak yen. So I think the immigration side is where we see her social conservatism coming out the most right now, and it does seem to be one where the public wants to see action.
Remind us of that famous quote that Sanae Takaichi made about work, 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 the importance of work, which seemed to split her own party, but obviously it's not done her bad in terms of popularity, seeing her renew her prime ministerialship. What did she say?
Well, she basically said what you said, which was, she's going to work, 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 and work. So that was, her um, approach has been interesting. And again, kind of against the grain when you think of discussions of work-life balance, because she sees herself as someone who wants to go above and beyond and really, work hard for the Japanese people. That did incur a lot of criticism from some quarters because people said that this was not a good way to model leadership because it sets a bad example and because Japan is already known for quite high levels of overwork in many cases. But on the other hand, it does seem to have appealed to people who perhaps feel that their government is not working hard enough for them. Again, we
Yes.
tend to see that populist sentiments arise when there's this unhappiness with the establishment. So she's trying to counter that and say, I will
Yeah.
work for you.
I think work, work, work. I think she abandoned the idea, didn't she, of work-life balance. Although enjoying herself at
Yes.
work, at least on the drums there, and saying that you need to work, quote, like a horse. Great to talk to you, Kristi Govella. Thank you so much for your time today. Associate
Thank you.
Professor of Japanese Politics, International Relations and Nissan Studies of Japanese Studies. Thank you for your time.